Good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to come today. My name is Peter Toogood. I'm the Chief Investment Officer of the Advisor Centre and the Embark Group. My challenge today is to try and put across the way in which fund managers that we interview on a daily basis are assessing the ESG credentials, their ESG credentials, and what they should be doing about it in terms of adapting it to their portfolios. Today's class will involve the following. It will involve back to basics. And that's pretty much looking at where we started in first principles, the UN principles to be precise. We're then going to look at the EU response thus far. They have been ahead of the game here in terms of looking at ESG, its integration, and what it means for investors. The next phase is SFDR in terms of those are the regulations as they apply. We're going to walk through those for the offshore fund range to understand what those mean, what managers have done about it, both the individual managers and the fund groups overall. Then a sort of a more holistic view of what fund managers have done in terms of the state of play in the UK thus far, how they're individually dealing with things, and then perhaps finally just a reminder of everything we've gone through in this presentation. So to start with, a reminder of the global goals, 17 in principle and in practice from the UN. They're not just about carbon. There is a dominance, obviously, of E in the conversations, generally speaking, but the S and the G certainly haven't been forgotten, but they often seem to lag. And of course, the E takes in so many more things. I think life at sea, life on land, gender equality, equality overall, poverty, etc., etc. There are many facets that one has to take into account when one is considering the nature and scope of what is doing the right thing in terms of investing, and how do we deal with the issue in relation to the fiduciary duty on the one hand and the duty to try our very best to minimise the damage and exploitation that their activities obviously and inevitably create. This is, I think, the back to basics from our perspective. It's a very simple way of expressing the challenge that everybody has, which is, on the one hand, you've got the principle of traditional investing, which is fiduciary duty primarily. Its primary goal is to maximize the opportunity or the return, typically, most of the time against what you would call a traditional benchmark of some sort, be it a single strategy, be it against a benchmark, or be it a volatility target, perhaps you're trying to achieve a maximum return within a risk. The risk not yet here defined on the left-hand side is the risk to the environment. As you move further along, you can see we can move from finance only on the bottom of the box to finance first, to impact only. And in many, many simple ways, I think that actually explains the challenge very early doors in this conversation about the greenwashing effect, which in principle and practice is an accusation being levelled on a constant basis, and in our view, and as we'll explain as we go along in this presentation, a little harshly so. There has been a lot of activity in this space previously. And although I'm not suggesting for 1 minute every single fund manager or fund management group is philanthropic, as you will see as we move through this process, the ESG has always been present as a factor in risk. If we go back to the first principles of what the regulations in Europe, the taxonomy, if you like, tried to achieve in terms of looking at mutual funds in total terms, 3 articles effectively, Article 6, Article 8 and Article 9, put very simply. To the left-hand side, to a degree, we've got Article 6, which is about ESG integration. You'll hear a lot of commentary around fund managers posing the question to us when we talk to them, but I already do ESG integrated activities. And to a very large degree, that is true. They have, and they've taken into account the environmental considerations, the social and the governance considerations before they've invested in a stock as part and parcel of what they've done for a number of years. I think it's often forgotten that a lot of the retail front-facing UK funds are often mimicked in institutional or segregated mandates, and now specifically, obviously, there's something to follow in terms of the offshore funds that have had to, within Europe, certainly conform to one of these 3 articles in one shape, actually badge themselves, if you like, into the buckets. Gives us a lot more material to work with in terms of a recognition of what the retail fund might look like, but an awful lot of mandates that many of them in running separately will have already had some exclusions, a specific ESG agenda applied to them anyway. So from the left, we go to, there's a degree of integration. Here, you'll typically be looking at minimum standards, I feel, is what we're looking at there in terms of ESG. To the right-hand side, the far side, the Article 9, it's impact only. So specifically there, the purpose of the investment would be for an ESG greater good. There will be a sustainable mandate right at the start of the process. And that's driving the underlying building of portfolios and the selection of stocks. In the middle, the Article 8 is perhaps the compromise. And this, we think, is probably where there's biggest scope for greenwashing in truth. And that's harsh because it's not really greenwashing. What it's saying is, I'm not quite sustainable. I am ESG integrated. I'm sort of in the middle. And we think that there's a massive scope for Article 8 to be a big problem because basically suits you. A lot of managers, for management groups and for managers themselves, are having aesthetic issues about where they wish to sit within the potential articles that exist onshore. They've already had to make those decisions offshore. And I have to say, the jury's out. Our evidence, and we've been talking, really, obviously this has been topical since Q4 of last year, but certainly into this year, every fund manager meeting we have, and we do a lot of them, is a conversation about, so where are you sitting? Easy with funds where there's an offshore equivalent, not so easy when there isn't. So again, in the next slide, you'll see how we've been dealing with that debate. This is a very complicated chart. It's not supposed to be, but unfortunately it's unavoidable. To the left-hand side, this is the MSCI indices. It's their alignment with the articles offshore. And I should say, sorry, at this point, that the UK regulations look like they're going to mimic, to a large degree, the decisions that have been made for the European funds. And that's quite important from our perspective, because it gives us, at least, as we've said, a footprint and a guide to where this may go. On the left-hand side, the indices they do create, and you can see basically the regime gets more inflexible, if you like, deliberately so, as the mandate becomes more sustainable. So at the top, you're dealing with funds or indexes which are incorporating, I would say, or we would say, largely ESG facets with the potential exclusions. And as you move down on the left-hand side to the bottom, you see a sustainable mandate is the priority. If you go across to the far right-hand side, you can see how those align with Article 8 and Article 9. And indeed, Article 9 is very clear there, only the last two apply. Definitely within the Paris Global Climate Change alignment, and definitely a sustainable mandate. So again, the indices themselves, the index providers, are reflecting the framework that's been created with SFDR, which is saying, on the left-hand side, Article 6, ESG integration, on the far right-hand side, a sustainable mandate, and number 8 is somewhere in between. And for the index providers, they also have that challenge of which stocks are applicable to what article. And the very definition of a sustainable stock is also obviously up for debate, and something we will pursue shortly as we carry on with this presentation. The state of play in the UK. Now, I think to a large degree, we've sort of brought it out into the open here with a pretty picture that basically looks like a fudge cake, a piece of fudge. For those of you who can remember and do remember the glorious days of fudge, we think it's where we are at the moment. At the moment, it's up for conversation. Advisors are supposed to incorporate it into conversations, as you all know, in terms of the client's approach to ESG. But that's very much front run the response that the UK dedicated domestic industry has offered up in terms of the regulatory approach. Again, we can look at some of the SFDR regulations to give us some understanding. The conversations we have had with fund managers are very much aligned with that as well. So we start in first principle with, so could you just tell us, have you got an offshore fund? Because often we're not aware. It's very interesting actually to follow through on this, because sometimes we haven't always been aware of mandates run offshore, and that commitment has had to be finalised over a period of time. So in that regard, we've got a nice benchmark to start from. And then some of the frustrations start coming out in terms of how they can be allocated in terms of Article 6, Article 8 and Article 9. And from our perspective, I'm just opening up something here so I can follow up on the presentation. It's the scope and nature of the regulatory response is still unknown. We think, we don't know, we have no more insight than anyone else, they're going to map out SFDR. And if that is the case, fund managers are committing today to this. At the moment, what we see is Article 6 appears to be dominating onshore. So the likely approach for most of the mandates thus far has been towards Article 6. There's a series of reasons for that, which again we'll come on to shortly. But for now, we think a lot of fund management groups are settling on 6, and they'll see how things progress. What we've noticed offshore is that mandates are already coming with requests that they're minimum Article 8 and sometimes explicitly Article 9. So thus far, what we have noticed is that the fund management group response has been to keep the existing vehicle as it is and create perhaps a sustainable version of a said vehicle. Again, something we'll highlight shortly as to how we've dealt with that. But up to now, it is a fudge. It is a challenge because every fund group's in a different stage of this journey. There's no standardization at all, both within fund groups and as explicitly within the fund managers themselves, each of who can obviously adapt an approach to suit their own purpose. So the greenwashing thing is a very, very simple term for what is a very complex issue, but there can be no ultimate consistency because no one is standardized. A few of the things we're about to discuss with you, which I think will highlight the challenge. This here is a very interesting one. We use ESG-ness because we're not really sure what other term we can use for this at this point. And it's not to be glib about it. It's just to point out, because there's no standardization, ESG is a multifaceted, multi-headed vehicle. What we're looking at is how do you assess funds in the future? What's going to count as success? And to some extent, most fund group managers and fund groups had an ESG element to their portfolios. We often said that in presentations we would have on funds that the ES and G would be there, but it would often be on page 12, page 20 of a presentation. It's now page 2 or 3. It was there, it wasn't just in the background, it just wasn't front and center in the considerations. Now it's very much a consideration. A standard meeting for us now would be a performance review, a portfolio composition review, changes to portfolio, and the ESG progression. So that is a complete change. We would not have been having that conversation a year ago. With mainstream fund managers, obviously we dedicated to sustainable managers, we might have been. But now every conversation we have involves a discussion about ESG, the scope and nature of how it's being applied, etc. So that's a big, big change. And you can see how it's changing because of the chart below, or chart in front of you, which shows you just simply how the AUM has multiplied through this process. It's significantly growing. I think the push in Europe particularly, where it's saying Article 8, Article 9 is pretty much a slam dunk if you want to create, certainly a seg mandate, and a lot of thought going into the mutual funds that we all can purchase today offshore and what article they'll fall into. So if you like, it's already there. Now, what we have noticed within this is how fund groups are approaching it. Some are putting dedicated teams together. They sit either to run products themselves, dedicated products, or they sit to assist the fund managers in the other areas. Other approaches we've also seen is fund analysts having an ESG bias within teams and being incorporated into teams. So again, there is no dogmatic approach to this. There is either you can have a group-wide resource or you can have a dedicated resource. And within that overall piece, most of them are using one form or another of a scoring process for understanding things like the carbon footprint, things like the waste or otherwise that companies have within their processes, etc. So in that vein, we move on to our next slide, which takes an assessment of some of these. There are different versions of ways in which companies can be graduated, but the problem is they are extremely subjective. We've got here in front of you an example, the MSCI and Sustainalytics. They've both got rating systems for stocks, utilised in different ways by investors. The common thread, often for manager meetings, one of these will be being used. Sustainalytics, I have to say, is perhaps more dominant in certainly the meetings we have. The problem is there are material differences. If you can look at the bar chart, you can see how different companies are defined by the same, effectively what is supposed to be an ESG approach where there's absolutely no commonality. And this is actually the real issue, the nub of the debate we have with fund managers. First of all, they're deemed backward looking, right or wrong. That is how fund managers see them. They're an assessment at the moment in time, and the rate of change and dynamism with which the whole ESG agenda is changing isn't reflected sufficiently quickly. I'll use VW as a fantastic example. Overnight seen as the potential tamer of the Tesla dominance in the EV space, immediately gets re-rated, but at the moment it's still seen as a triple C stock in terms of its ESG credentials, even though it is very clearly moving towards electrification of its motor vehicle pool and investing heavily on the basis of that. And I guess that's exactly what we think is the issue for fund managers. There isn't a one size fits all, and the dynamism of it means that you can't just be very glib about saying, oh, that's an XYZ company, I exclude it because of a database that tells me it's a bad company. And I think that is a constant debate, particularly with fund managers. And this is the point to make on the next slide as we see the approach, which is the day in the life of. They have to deal with this every day. So take what I just said about VW and decide how you might approach that if you're a fund manager. You've got basically, and this is the title of this whole presentation, is the debate between exclusion and engagement. And it's a fairly constant conversation we're having. And pretty much, unless it's an Article 9 style sustainable dedicated mandate, we would argue that the bulk of managers we're talking to are not in favour of hard exclusions. They want to express their own preferences. Few will deliberately seek out a hard exclusion of the typical sinning stocks of your tobaccos, your armaments, gambling, alcohol, etc. But what we have said, and I think what is becoming increasingly clear, is there's an expectation the cost of capital for all these companies will continue to rise. And if you look at the second piece, I think just highlighting that particularly, it says the recent price action in tobacco, a suggestion of the nicotine being withdrawn from the tobacco stocks, was enough to send the tobacco stocks into a tailspin, quite frankly. And actually that is most of the time the conversation we're having with fund managers is that the sinning companies, if you like, definition given by many, is that they will simply lose the ability to access capital markets. The way in which the products harm or their activities harm is going to be sufficient to see the cost of capital rise, either evoking a change in behaviour or, of course, ultimately starving the said industry of capital so that it actually can't exist. So either way, fund managers, even if they're not on hard exclusion, are definitely questioning, typically, particularly, I would say, or we would say, exposure to energy stocks and to tobacco stocks. So if you like, there's a slow progression towards the goals of harm in specific terms in relation to those kind of stocks. Within the S and the G, however, I think that is much more interesting. And again, much more interesting in the sense that you can actually grab it more physically. What is the diversity? What is the governance code? How are corporate management behaving? What is their overall approach, et cetera, et cetera? So in that regard, better definitions. The more contentious part definitely comes towards harm/environment. I think the S and the G, most fund managers we talk to feel that they have a reasonable handle on. And that's largely a function of if it's a badly managed company and it's not a particularly diverse company, you'll often find it doesn't achieve very much. And that actually means that often the fund managers have been in the vanguard of actually ensuring that S&G has been prima facie front and centre. And that's not a sort of hurrah session on my part just for fund management groups. It's an observation that S&G has been very active. What is also very clear is that level of scrutiny will continue to expand. And fund managers will be very aware of their obligations to ensure that companies are, let's call it the right way, behaving in an optimal fashion. I think the opportunity, however, which is really interesting, is if those rate of change companies are real. And I think this is where the exclusion engagement debate becomes very live. And this is where the greenwashing thing is going to become contentious. Because do you want a VW or even an energy company that that is going to go renewable. Total has made great statements about this as a good working example. So Shell and BP. There is a massive debate amongst fund managers about whether that is real or even possible in the case of what is, after all, an oil-based energy company, primarily in the case of, say, a BP and a Shell. And it's whether you think that it is right for capital to be used to change the scope and nature of the businesses, which, after all, are in the energy business, or not. And that debate is going to remain constant. But the good thing is, assuming that we can follow or track something similar to SFDR regulations, you'll have your choice. Nearly every fund that you're currently buying for your client today will have ESG integration as part of its process. And on the other hand, you'll be able to progress towards the sustainable mandate and a definition of that. I would hope by the balance of this year, we'll have greater clarity about how far we're tracking this. But within that, you'll be able to make selections. And obviously, to the right-hand side, for sustainable will be exclusions, which may well suit the client. And to the left-hand side, there'll be best endeavours to, as I say, minimise impact, which I think is important. Just to throw a few stones in the pond on some of the ESG piece, though. It's important to understand exclusions are intellectually challenging for fund managers. They don't want to screen specifically in front of, most of the time, unless it's a sustainable mandate, most of the time a screen in front of their process of picking stocks, mostly from indices. And if you remember, most fund managers pick within an index a selection of stocks, and their primary goal is to beat that benchmark. I think where there is a challenge, however, if you do deep analysis, and this is an interesting and contentious slide, do bear with me, I apologise. There we go, to the next slide here, which is shades of grey in ESG. So again, to reinforce the point, we can all do our good work on who we think is a carbon footprint and who is causing the damage. This was undertaken by Bank of America relatively recently, and it shows that tech companies, if you use scope 3 emissions, i.e. everybody else's footprint who you engage in work with, into your equation, tech companies come out as one of the worst emitters in terms of the carbon footprint. That may not seem too obvious to everybody, but then again, if you actually think backwards and work out what they enable, who they work with, and how it operates, you can make the argument that, in fact, technology companies are one of the worst offenders in terms of the scope 3 emissions in particular, which is unfair. At the end of the day, Amazon is distributing products, the final mile to our front door, but it involves logistics, it involves warehouse, it involves moving stuff around. I'm being simplistic, but it's sort of an example. The server farms in the cloud, have you any idea how much energy they actually use and how often they burn out? The server farms have to replace constantly. So if I put those back into the equation, you can see how they become strong emitters. So again, it's not always as simple an analysis as you use coal or use carbon, therefore you're a bad company. It's not as simple as that. It needs to be deeper than that. And what it needs to mostly be about is saying to individuals, actually, have you got a fund manager that recognises all these things and is looking to do their best to make sure that as the regulations and indeed the whole environment around us changes, for ESG to be front and centre in terms of the way we all invest, is that fund manager following that path? And then you're just discussing the degree to which they're committed to that. And that's the key. From our perspective in terms of analysis. And we want nice clarity. We're trying to get the right boxes. Again, slamming home the point with these learnings, and this is the last couple of minutes I have, so I will really make the point here on these learnings. What we've tried to look at in this is the old assertion that it's fiduciary duty first primarily and only that. That is already passé. That is not happening. That is not changing. There is now investing which will conflict with philanthropy. And they're being integrated together. If you like, no one will be involved in businesses that are automatically there just to exploit with no understanding, both either of the planet or of humanity within that planet, with no off button. So that's, I think, by the way, from my personal perspective, very, very welcome. ESG factors integrated across the piece. It's absolutely happening. We're living it every single day. All regulated fund managers will have an ESG baseline. By the way, let's cheer for that. I think rather than too much of the accusation of greenwashing, and there's plenty to be levelled, I personally think it should be very welcome that there's going to be a minimum threshold for this. And then we're fighting about how much that dominates the debate, which for me is a big shift on. I think that's a good thing. There's a lot of ways of investing in sustainable vehicles already. The clarity around those, again, should be, I think, very simple. Sustainable mandates, ESG integration, and there'll be something in between. Again, there'll be more clarity in this as the year progresses. We're doing our work now to understand that more and more and more. So it's going to be ESG integration, engagement, sustainability first, or exclusion. Let's just look at the trade-offs of those and not stop the fund manager in their tracks with their good work, which ultimately is they can drive this on our behalf. So let's do the greater analysis. We are doing that today. We're bringing as much clarity as we can as our peers in terms of the ratings world. Better clarity this year with UK regulation will allow us all to press those buttons to say with a greater degree of certainty how a fund actually presents itself. Finally, until we have those definitions, it's going to be accusations of greenwashing. But again, I would caution, my own personal opinion is we should be pleased with the baseline we've created. I think it's all progression from here. Thank you for your time. I hope it's been useful.